I didn't do anything wrong, just wanted some passion after years of feeling unseen. When my lover shoved my husband at that party, I laughed and even clapped. But 30 seconds later, when papers landed in my lap, I realized Caleb wasn't broken. He was ready. I always told myself I deserved more than the quiet little life Caleb tried to keep me in. I was 34, not dead, and I wanted to feel alive again. That's why when Victor, my boss, started noticing me at work, I didn't push him away. He made me feel important in ways Caleb never managed. Caleb was dependable, yes, always home by 6, dinner on the table, stories for Maya before bed. But dependable soon turned into predictable. Predictable turned into dull, and dull felt like suffocation. I started telling myself I was not doing anything wrong by leaning into Victor's attention. It was just conversation at first, harmless comments about my hair or how no one kept the office organized like I did. But when I stayed late and he leaned against my desk with that easy smile, I felt something spark. That was mine, wasn't it? To feel wanted, to feel special. I told Caleb I was working extra hours because of the new system rollout. He nodded, trusting as always, and told me not to burn myself out. His trust irritated me. He didn't even question why I needed so many late nights. Part of me wanted him to. If he had shown jealousy, maybe I would have thought twice. Instead, he just said he was proud of me. The first time I rode home with Victor after work, it was because he said it wasn't safe for me to walk alone in the dark. I let him. When I stepped into our house smelling faintly of his cologne, Caleb asked about it. I laughed, told him I had passed someone in the hallway at work who wore too much aftershave. He believed me, or maybe he didn't. His eyes lingered a second too long, but then he kissed my cheek and went back to stirring the pot on the stove. I told Clara about it the next day, more as a brag than a confession. She smirked and said all men get jealous over nothing. She told me Caleb should be glad another man saw me as attractive, because it meant I was still valuable. That word stuck, valuable. It sounded better than guilty. I went home that night and dropped hints about how Marcus, my manager, said my efficiency was unmatched. Caleb smiled and said he always knew I was talented. I wanted him to push back, to argue, to fight. Instead, he just poured me a glass of wine and asked about Maya's school day. I brushed him off, saying I was too tired to chat. At bedtime, I heard him reading to Maya in the other room. His voice was steady, gentle. I felt annoyed at the sound. While I was reaching for something new, he was content to just exist, fatherly and boring. The lies piled up easily after that. Late-night drinks with Victor became budget meetings. Lingering lunches became team strategy sessions. Once, when Caleb called during one of those lunches, I ignored it. Later, I told him my phone had been on silent for hours. He accepted it with a nod. That night, he asked if I was happy. I said, of course, why wouldn't I be? He looked at me for a long moment, then turned back to washing dishes. At work, Victor's praise became bolder. He said I deserved more than I was getting at home. He said I had the drive to be more than just a wife and mother. His words melted into my chest like heat. I told myself it wasn't cheating to enjoy the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me papers. It wasn't cheating to let him drive me home, or to laugh too loudly at his jokes. It was harmless. Caleb was too serious to understand. When Marjorie, my mother-in-law, asked why I was never at family dinners anymore, I told her Caleb exaggerated. I said men get needy when their wives are busy. She narrowed her eyes at me, but said nothing. That silence unnerved me more than words would have. Maya started asking questions too. She wanted to know why I wasn't home to tuck her in. I said Mommy had important work to do, so she could buy her pretty things. She nodded, but her face fell. I convinced myself she would understand when she was older. By the end of the month, I had perfected my routine. I would come home late, smelling faintly of Victor's cologne, tell Caleb I had been at the office, then climb into bed as if nothing was wrong. He didn't confront me again. He just watched me sometimes, a quiet look I couldn't read. I told Clara about it. She said he was probably just sulking and that I should ignore him. I agreed, though part of me felt uneasy. One night, when I returned later than usual, Caleb was waiting in the living room. The lamp was on, his laptop closed beside him. He asked directly why I was out so late. I smiled and said we had been fixing a payroll error. He asked if Victor was with me. I tilted my head and told him he was imagining things. He sat there, silent, his eyes fixed on me. I told him he needed to trust me, or we had no marriage. He nodded once, stood, and walked to the bedroom. That nod unsettled me more than any accusation would have. I realized then that his silence was not weakness, it was calculation. But I told myself I was imagining it, just as I told him he was. The next morning, he made pancakes for Maya, laughing at her jokes while I scrolled through my phone. He looked ordinary, content, like always. And yet something in the way he watched me made me wonder if the ground under my feet was already shifting. I brushed it off. Victor had texted me during breakfast, and the thrill of his attention drowned out everything else. Family dinners had always been dull affairs, the kind where my father asked the same questions and my mother fussed about the roast being too dry. But this time, everything felt different. I arrived with Caleb and Maya, but I may as well have been alone. Caleb hadn't spoken a word in the car, and even Maya sat quietly in the back, clutching her book. I walked in with a smile, determined to turn the night in my favor. Clara was already there, and she winked at me knowingly. She always loved hearing about Victor. We sat down, and my father asked Caleb how work was. Caleb gave one-sentence answers, his eyes fixed on his plate. The silence irritated me, so I filled it by talking about Victor. I described how efficient he was, how sharp his mind was in meetings, how he praised my ideas. I even said Victor believed I had the skills to run my own department one day. Clara nodded, grinning, and said Caleb should be proud to have a wife who was so admired. I basked in her support, raising my glass and laughing. But then, Marjorie's voice cut through the air. She asked why I had to bring up Victor in every sentence. Her tone was sharp, her eyes piercing. I pretended not to notice and said she was just old-fashioned, that modern women worked with men and that was normal. Caleb stayed silent. He didn't defend me, didn't defend himself, just sat there chewing slowly. I hated that passivity. It made me feel like I was speaking into a void. To break the tension, I made a joke. I said Caleb never understood ambition because he was too small-minded. I let out a laugh, hoping others would join in, but only Clara chuckled weakly. My mother looked at me with disappointment, and my father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maya pushed peas around her plate without looking up. Marjorie slammed her fork down and said, I was humiliating her son. She said Caleb wasn't insecure. He was being disrespected. I snapped back that she was overreacting, that Caleb was sensitive and needed to toughen up. I smiled like it was a joke, but the room stayed silent. Caleb set his fork down and finally looked at me. His eyes were unreadable, but I saw something there. Hurt, maybe anger, maybe something worse. He didn't say anything. He just held my gaze for a moment and then looked away. That silence was heavier than any words he could have spoken. After dinner, Clara pulled me aside in the kitchen. She said I was right, that Caleb needed to get over himself. She told me I should keep doing what made me happy. I nodded, but something about her tone felt less certain than usual. When I rejoined the others, I saw Marjorie whispering to my mother. Their eyes flicked toward me and then back down. I felt cornered, judged, but instead of softening, I doubled down. On the drive home, Caleb didn't say a word. I told him he embarrassed me by sitting there like a statue while I had to carry the whole conversation. He just kept his eyes on the road. I accused him of making me look like a villain, of letting his mother talk down to me. Still nothing. His silence was infuriating. When we got home, Maya went straight to bed without asking for a story. I noticed Caleb watching her close her door. He looked sad, but when I tried to bring it up, he shook his head and walked past me. The next day, I told Clara that Caleb was sulking again. She laughed and said men always sulk when women take control. I repeated that line to myself all afternoon, using it as armor. At work, Victor asked how my family dinner had gone. I rolled my eyes and said Caleb was jealous, that he couldn't handle the fact someone else appreciated me. Victor smirked and said Caleb sounded insecure. I let his words sink in like validation, ignoring the gnawing in my chest. Later that week, my parents invited us for another meal, hoping to smooth things over. I dressed carefully, determined to show them I was confident and unbothered. At the table, my father asked gently how Caleb and I were doing. I jumped in before Caleb could answer, saying we were fine, that he just had trouble adjusting to my growing responsibilities. Clara nodded eagerly, but Marjorie shook her head in disgust. She said no husband should have to watch his wife flaunt another man's name every chance she gets. I told her Victor was just a colleague, that she was paranoid. Caleb stayed silent again. That silence was starting to frighten me in ways I didn't want to admit. At one point, I leaned toward Clara and whispered that Victor excited me in ways Caleb never could. I thought I was being discreet, but when I looked up, Caleb's eyes were fixed on me. He had heard. His expression didn't change. He just looked at me for a long moment, then turned back to his plate. That blank stare made my stomach tighten. After dinner, Caleb excused himself and left the room. Marjorie glared at me, my father sighed, and my mother shook her head. Clara touched my arm and whispered not to let them make me feel guilty. But for once, her words didn't wash the tension away. When we got home, Caleb finally spoke. He asked if I was in love with Victor. I laughed and said he was imagining things, that he was paranoid. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and went to bed. His calmness rattled me more than anger ever could. The next morning, I woke to find him already gone, his side of the bed cold. For the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. It wasn't that I thought he would leave. No, Caleb was too stable for that. But the way he had looked at me across the table, the way he had stayed silent while I twisted the story, it felt like he was building something in that silence, something I couldn't see. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Victor had texted me good morning with a little compliment about my dress from yesterday. That thrill was enough to push the unease aside, at least for now. After that dinner where Caleb overheard me whispering about Victor, I thought the worst had already happened. He didn't shout, didn't storm out, didn't throw accusations. He just carried on with that blank expression, which somehow unsettled me more than anger would have. I convinced myself his silence meant he was powerless, that he had no idea what to do with me. I told Clara the next day, bragging that he wouldn't even fight for me, that he just sat there taking it. Clara said that was proof he was weak, that I had the upper hand. I let myself believe it because the alternative, that his silence meant planning, was too frightening. That week, I slipped deeper into Victor's orbit. At the office, I stayed late almost every night. Victor made it easy. He ordered food, poured wine, and always said the right things. He told me I deserved better than someone who just sat quietly at dinner tables. He said I was vibrant, too alive to be stuck in a dull marriage. I laughed and told him he was right, that Caleb didn't understand me anymore. One Friday evening, when everyone else had left, Victor leaned across his desk and said we should stop pretending. I didn't resist. His apartment that night felt like stepping into a new life. It was sleek, stylish, full of energy that my home no longer carried. I stayed until almost 2 a.m. When I crept back into my house, Caleb was still awake, sitting at the dining table with a folder in front of him. He didn't say a word, just closed it carefully as I walked in. My heart jumped, but I forced a smile and said we had been fixing payroll problems. He didn't argue, didn't accuse, just nodded and went to bed. That quiet nod, felt like a blade pressed against my skin. Over the next days, the atmosphere at home grew unbearable. Maya avoided me. She used to beg me to read bedtime stories, but now she went straight to Caleb. When I tried to hug her, she stiffened. I told myself it was just a phase, but deep down, I knew she was sensing everything. Marjorie dropped by unannounced one afternoon, finding me alone in the kitchen. She asked bluntly if I was seeing another man. I laughed in her face, told her she was paranoid, told her Caleb was poisoning her mind against me. Her lips tightened, and she left without another word. Later, when Caleb came home, he didn't mention it, but the way he glanced at me told me he knew exactly what had happened. I decided then that I had to double down on the story. That evening, when he asked why I'd been so late again, I sighed dramatically and said I was working myself to the bone for our future. I accused him of being ungrateful, of never appreciating what I was trying to build for us. He didn't rise to the bait. He just said, "For us?" quietly, and walked away. That question rattled me, but I pushed it aside. Clara kept reassuring me. She said Caleb was just jealous, and that jealousy was proof he still cared. I repeated her words like a mantra, but the folder I'd seen on the table that night stayed lodged in my mind. What was in it? Receipts, photos, evidence. I wanted to believe he wouldn't dare, but the thought gnawed at me. Meanwhile, Victor grew bolder. He started talking about trips we could take together, places we could go where no one knew us. I didn't commit, but the thought thrilled me. At the same time, I caught Caleb watching me closely, not with suspicion but with that same unnerving calm. Once, when I came home late, he was sitting in Maya's room, reading to her while she leaned against his chest. She looked at him with such trust, it made something twist inside me. I stood in the doorway, unseen, and felt like an intruder in my own house. Another night, when I returned past midnight, Caleb was in the kitchen again, the folder open this time. I caught a glimpse, printed emails, receipts from restaurants I had forgotten about, even a grainy photo of me and Victor walking into his apartment. My throat went dry. He closed it before I could say anything. I demanded to know what he was doing. He looked up and said calmly, "Making sure the truth doesn't get lost." My blood ran cold. I lashed out then, accused him of spying, of being controlling, of trying to trap me. He didn't argue. He just said he wasn't the one trapping anyone. Then he went upstairs and left me standing in the kitchen, shaking with anger and fear. I called Clara immediately, telling her Caleb was going through my things. She said he was bluffing, that men like to act like detectives but never followed through. I clung to that, though it sounded weak even in my own ears. The following weekend, Victor invited me to a social event downtown. He said it would be fun to relax, to show me off. I agreed, desperate to escape the suffocating silence of my home. But even as I put on my dress and makeup, I couldn't shake the image of Caleb's folder, neatly filled with pieces of my betrayal. Still, I told myself it was fine. He hadn't confronted me, hadn't shouted, hadn't left. He was still there, which meant I still had control. I stepped out the door that night convinced I was untouchable, even as a part of me whispered that something was coming, something I couldn't stop. The night of the downtown event is seared into my memory because it was the moment I thought I had won. Victor had invited me to a lounge opening, a place full of glass walls, low lights, and music that hummed in the chest. He said I should wear something bold, so I chose a red dress Caleb would never have liked. Too loud, too daring. When Victor saw me, he whistled and told me I was the star of the evening. I laughed, clinging to that thrill like oxygen. We arrived together, and people noticed. Some whispered, others smiled knowingly. I didn't care. I wanted the world to see me as more than Caleb's quiet little wife. We sat near the bar, Victor's hand casually resting on mine, and for the first time in years I felt radiant. Then I saw Caleb. He stood near the entrance, his shoulders straight, his face expressionless. For a second, my heart stuttered, but I covered it with a laugh. Victor noticed him too. He smirked and asked if that was my husband. I nodded, pretending to be unbothered. Caleb didn't move toward us at first. He just watched. Finally, he crossed the room and stood in front of our table. He asked me quietly what I was doing there. I told him I was networking, that he was embarrassing me by showing up. He looked at Victor and asked if this was what late nights at the office really meant. I rolled my eyes, telling him he was paranoid, that he needed to stop making a scene. Victor leaned back in his chair, grinning like it was all a game. Then he stood and said, maybe Caleb should leave if he couldn't handle it. Caleb didn't flinch. He said calmly that I was still his wife. Victor laughed and stepped closer, chest out, and shoved him hard enough that Caleb stumbled back. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was exhilaration. I clapped, actually clapped, and said Caleb should learn to be a man. I laughed loudly, drawing attention from nearby tables. For a fleeting second, I felt triumphant, like I had finally humiliated him into submission. But then something happened I didn't expect. Caleb straightened, brushed himself off, and didn't fight back. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table in front of me without a word. My laughter caught in my throat. I opened it instinctively, and my stomach dropped. Inside were legal papers, divorce filings, custody petitions, financial disclosures. Every page neatly typed, every detail already prepared. I froze, my face burning as Victor leaned over my shoulder and whistled again, but this time at the papers. He muttered that Caleb wasn't as weak as I thought. My hands shook as I shoved the papers back into the envelope. I looked at Caleb, expecting anger or pain, but his face was calm, almost detached. He simply said, "I'm done," and turned to walk out of the lounge. The silence that followed was deafening. People around us had seen the shove, seen me cheer, seen Caleb leave with dignity while I sat there trembling. Victor pulled his hand away from mine and said maybe I should handle my situation before I kept coming around. He moved back toward the bar, chatting with someone else within minutes, as if I was nothing. The triumph I'd felt seconds earlier dissolved into dread. I called Clara on the way home, almost shouting into the phone. I told her Caleb had embarrassed me with papers in public. She said he was bluffing, that no man would actually go through with it. I clung to her words like a rope in the dark, but when I got home, Caleb's side of the bed was already empty, his closet half cleared, the folder from the kitchen table gone. Only the envelope remained, heavy on my nightstand, daring me to deny what was coming. Maya's room was quiet, her bed neatly made. I realized Caleb must have taken her to Marjorie's for the night. Panic flared, but I buried it under indignation. I told myself he was just trying to scare me, that he would regret it once the drama settled. But as I lay in bed, staring at that envelope, I couldn't shake the feeling that my laughter at the lounge had been the last mistake I would ever get away with. The next morning, woke to silence, a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Caleb's side of the bed was still empty, the sheets cold. I went into Maya's room and found it bare of her usual clutter, no doll on the pillow, no books on the nightstand. Panic rose in my chest as I realized he had taken her. I grabbed my phone and called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message demanding to know where he was, telling him he couldn't just walk out with our daughter like that. No reply. An hour later, a courier arrived at the door. He handed me another envelope, thicker than the one from last night. Inside were copies of the divorce petition, custody requests, financial freezes, and even a temporary restraining order, preventing me from removing Maya from school without his consent. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the papers. I called Clara immediately. She told me not to panic, that Caleb was just trying to scare me, that no judge would take a child away from her mother over some dinners and a fling. But when I showed her the documents later that afternoon, even she fell silent. The evidence was overwhelming. There were screenshots of text messages I thought I had deleted, emails confirming late-night meetings that never existed, even a witness statement from a coworker who had seen me leave with Victor. My throat closed as I flipped through the pages. I asked Clara what I should do, but her face was pale. She muttered that Caleb must have been planning this for months. That thought chilled me more than the papers themselves. While I had been laughing at him, mocking him, cheering when Victor shoved him, Caleb had been quietly building a case piece by piece. That evening, my parents came over. I showed them the documents, hoping for sympathy, but instead I found disappointment. My father's jaw was tight as he asked if I had really been seeing Victor. I tried to deny it, tried to say it was all exaggerated, but the evidence in front of them made my words sound hollow. My mother sighed and said she couldn't defend me this time. Only Clara still tried, snapping that Caleb was manipulative, that he was trying to turn everyone against me. But even she didn't sound convinced. Later that night, Caleb returned to the house, not to stay, but to collect more of his things. He was calm, too calm. He asked if I had read everything. I said it was ridiculous, that he was overreacting, that nothing had happened between Victor and me. He raised an eyebrow and said, "So, all of this is fabricated?" I opened my mouth but couldn't answer. He continued, telling me he wasn't going to yell, wasn't going to fight. He said the court would decide, and that the truth was already written down in documents and records. I begged then, dropping my mask, telling him we could fix it, that I still loved him. He looked at me with eyes so tired they seemed decades older. He said, "You cheered when another man shoved me. That was all I needed to know." Those words sliced through me worse than any anger could. He picked up the folder, kissed Maya's stuffed toy that had fallen on the floor, and left again without another glance. Clara told me afterward that I needed to get a lawyer of my own. I did, but even my lawyer looked grim when she read the papers. She said Caleb had moved swiftly and strategically, that he had protected his accounts, documented everything, and established himself as the stable parent. She asked me bluntly if there was any chance I could prove the affair didn't happen. I stammered, saying it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything. She shook her head and said the court wouldn't care about my feelings, only about facts. I spent the next days calling Caleb, leaving voicemails he never returned. I told him he was breaking our family, that he was overreacting, that Maya needed her mother. No reply. When I went to see Maya at school, she clung to him, hiding behind his legs. I tried to hug her, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Caleb didn't stop her. He didn't say anything cruel. He just looked at me with that same steady calm and guided her into the car. Watching them drive away made me realize he wasn't bluffing. He was erasing me, legally and quietly, while I scrambled for excuses. That night, I sat at the dining table with both envelopes spread out in front of me. One was from the lounge, one from the courier, and together they told the story of my downfall. I had thought I was in control, that I was untouchable, that Caleb was too weak to act. But while I was chasing thrills and mocking him, he was building a fortress of evidence, and now that fortress was closing around me, leaving me cornered, desperate, and utterly powerless. The day of the court hearing felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I walked into the courthouse in a black dress, trying to look composed, but inside my chest everything rattled. Caleb was already there, sitting with his lawyer, perfectly calm. He didn't even look at me when I entered. That hurt more than if he had glared. It was as if I had ceased to exist for him. When the session began, his lawyer presented the folder I had seen so many times at home. Every page was like a nail hammered into the coffin of my marriage. Photos of me arriving at Victor's apartment late at night. Screenshots of messages where I complained to Clara that Caleb was boring and that Victor was exciting. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners charged on nights I told Caleb I was working. Witness testimonies from co-workers who had seen me leaving with Victor after hours. I sat frozen as it all poured out, each piece of evidence neatly fitting, the next like a puzzle designed to prove I was unfaithful. My lawyer tried to argue it was circumstantial, that nothing physical had been proven, but even I could hear the weakness in her tone. Caleb's lawyer countered calmly, pointing to patterns, timelines, and how I had lied to my family repeatedly. Then Caleb spoke. His voice was steady, low, but clear. He said he wasn't seeking revenge, only stability for his daughter. He said Maya deserved a safe, honest home where she wouldn't be exposed to betrayal and humiliation. He said he had no desire to slander me, only to protect her. The judge leaned forward, listening carefully. When it was my turn, I tried to defend myself. I said I loved Caleb, that Victor had meant nothing, that I had been under pressure and needed recognition. My voice cracked, and the words came out sounding pitiful. The judge asked directly why, if it was harmless, I had hidden it, mocked Caleb in public, and allowed my lover to shove him while I laughed. My mouth went dry. I tried to say Caleb was too sensitive, that he misinterpreted, but the courtroom stayed silent. Even my own parents wouldn't meet my eyes. My father sat stiffly, my mother wiping at her eyes with a tissue. Marjorie looked triumphant, as if she had known this day would come all along. Clara alone glared at Caleb, whispering under her breath that he was cruel. But even she couldn't deny how damning the evidence looked. The decision didn't take long. Temporary full custody of Maya went to Caleb, with me allowed visitation under strict terms. Financial protections were ordered in his favor, with joint accounts frozen and his income secured separately. The family home was awarded to him until final arrangements could be decided. My lawyer squeezed my arm and whispered that we could appeal, but her eyes betrayed the truth. I had already lost. Caleb didn't gloat. He didn't even look relieved. He just nodded at the judge's words, thanked him respectfully, and began gathering his papers. Maya, sitting beside Marjorie, clung to his hand as soon as he approached. She didn't even glance at me. That moment broke something inside me. I stood frozen, watching as they left the courtroom together. People whispered as I remained behind, papers trembling in my hands. Clara tried to comfort me, saying we would find a way to fight back, but her voice was shaky. My parents walked past me without a word. Outside, the air felt heavy. Reporters weren't there. It wasn't that kind of case. But the humiliation was just as public in its own way. Everyone who mattered had seen. Everyone who mattered knew. I drove back to the house on autopilot, my mind blank. When I walked inside, the emptiness struck me like a blow. Caleb's clothes were gone from the closet. His books, his shaving kit, even the little things like his favorite mug. Maya's toys were missing too. Her drawings had been taken from the fridge, leaving faint tape marks behind. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. On the kitchen counter sat a single envelope. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was the finalized custody schedule, neatly printed with dates and times for when I could see Maya. Each line was cold, factual, unyielding. Beneath it was a short note in Caleb's handwriting. Please respect this, for her sake. My knees buckled, and I sank into a chair. The house was silent, so silent it roared in my ears. I realized then that this was the end. No shouting, no dramatic farewell, just documents, schedules, and absence. Caleb hadn't needed to destroy me with anger. He had done it with patience, with law, with silence. He had erased me from his life piece by piece until all that was left was paper. I looked around the empty house, at the echoes of the family I had once had, and understood finally that I had cheered when my lover shoved my husband, but Caleb had delivered the last blow without ever raising his voice. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.